Hey, Dr. Jon Finn here. Welcome to the Habit Mechanic podcast. Right now, you can get my new best-selling book, Train Your Brain for the AI Revolution, at tougherminds.co.uk. The digital book, audiobook, and physical book are all available at a special price that you won't find anywhere else.
Hello, Habit Mechanics. It's Dr. Jon Finn here. Welcome to another episode of the Habit Mechanic podcast. Today, we are going to dive into chapter 9 of the book. Chapter 9 is the first chapter within step 2 of the book. So the Habit Mechanic is separated into 4 distinct steps. The title of step 2 is Learn About the Secret Brain Science that will unlock your potential. And the title of chapter 9 is How Your Brain Works. This is the first of a few chapters where we really dig into the brain. So we're going to talk about this in detail. I'm also joined today by my friend and colleague, Andrew Whitelam. Andrew, how are you?
Yes, hi there, John. Great to be here again. I remember when I was reading the Habit Mechanic book and we got to this step 2, you really start to get a sense of excitement because what's gone before has been fascinating and engaging, but you really feel you're now getting up to speed with some super powerful science that you can apply in your life to really improve any aspect of your life you want. So I really did enjoy this section of the book, and I think it's fascinating in this section that you actually pose people a question. You rightly highlight how we live in a world of distractions and pressures. We have social media, we have different social media platforms emerging day by day, which show us things about other people's lives, tell us things we should be doing, tell us things we shouldn't be doing, put this pressure on us, get us into ways of thinking that are really unhelpful for us. And you highlight that when we have what can be a very damaging situation and challenge in front of us, although it's very powerful and in some cases people find it very difficult, we do have a choice when we face these challenges.
Yeah, so the starting point always has to be how well did I do my best to be at my best? Because there are far more things that we can control, or let me rephrase that, we are in a better position to control how we feel than anybody else is to help us to do that. So we have an awful lot of control, much more than we give ourselves credit for. And when we start to learn how our brain works and how we think, then we've got a much better chance of managing the thinking process, therefore managing what we habitualize in terms of thinking and doing.
Yeah, and to help people think about how they can choose to be their best. You do highlight a continuum. We've talked before about the VUCA world, the volatile, unpredictable, complex, ambiguous world. That phrase that many moons ago the US military coined to highlight the dangers of the world in a strategic military sense, but it applies so well to our changing societies and our changing daily routines because of things like social media and distractions. At one end there's that, and then at the other end, something you call me power conditioning.
Yeah, so me power was a term that we came up with maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago now, just trying to capture this idea that we have an awful lot of power over our own lives. So me power conditioning is the idea that I am deliberately working on myself. We often connect the idea of conditioning with physical conditioning, or we can also do psychological conditioning. So me power conditioning is I'm deliberately putting my best foot forwards and working on myself. We see that with the T plan in chapter 1. How well did I do my best to be at my best? And doing me power conditioning is the first step to becoming a habit mechanic. And this goes beyond the individual. If you want to have a high performing team, a high performing organization, the first thing you're going to need is to pack it full of people that are doing me power conditioning, that are prepared to work on themselves, to be at their best, to take responsibility. So we have more power over what we think and what we do than we give ourselves credit for. And me power conditioning gives us something as tangible to I suppose label ourselves with, label our behaviors and our actions with, and other people's at a high level.
Yeah, and I think that's so helpful when you fit it together with this idea of stating and pointing out to people that they do have a choice. It's not just them against this massive tsunami of distraction and pressure. They have a choice to and how to react. And me power is a fantastic way, I think, of capturing it and helping them. In the book, in chapter 9, you then move on to explain how we can start to begin working on ourselves and improving things. And the starting point is quite a succinct but powerful phrase: thinking about our thinking. And you get people to understand that the way the brain works at a very fundamental level, we're always thinking. You have a fantastic exercise for doing this. Perhaps you could take us through it now on the podcast.
Yeah, so we're always thinking. That's quite hard to understand if we don't deliberately think about it, because we're so automated in our thinking and our doing. So yeah, a quick way to understand this is if you just notice right now that you're talking to yourself, and if it's helpful to think about that, just imagine you're wearing an invisible pair of headphones, so you could cup your hands onto your ears loosely. Just imagine you're wearing an invisible pair of headphones. Think about the size of the headphones, the color of the headphones, the brand. Are they big noise cancelers, or are they small pods? And then as you're doing this, you can notice maybe a favorite song or a podcast or album or playlist that you're listening to, or even audiobook. And then also, as you're doing this, notice how you're speaking to yourself. And if you don't think you're speaking to yourself, notice how you're saying to yourself, I'm not speaking to myself. I'm not a crazy person. This is going on all the time. So we are speaking to ourselves all the time. So we are thinking all the time. It's always there. And when we start to recognize it, we can start to get more control over it. So instead of telling myself how rubbish the world is and how unlucky I am and how terrible my life is, I can refocus my attention onto all the things that I could be grateful for. Like, I'm really grateful for the person that made these headphones that I'm listening to the podcast on. I'm really grateful to the person that made the phone that I'm listening to the podcast on. I'm really lucky to have a roof over my head. I'm really fortunate to be able to have a few meals today, as many people in the world starving. Just one example of how we can refocus our attention to something that's more helpful for us. In chapter 22, we have lots of little frameworks that we use, like our WABAs and our FAB frameworks, etc. But yeah, in short, we're always thinking. And I think that example, that little exercise, makes it very clear that we are, and that we can start to control and manage. I think probably manage is a better word. We can start to manage how we think, to get our attention onto things that are more helpful for our health, our happiness, and our performance.
Yeah, because I think another fascinating and critical point that you make in the book is that it's important for people to realize, if we do as humans continue to have these unhelpful thoughts, we actually train ourselves to become better at unhelpful thinking. That was a real revelation to me when I read it.
Yeah, so the same rules always apply. We get good at what we practice. So in chapter 5 of the book, and we did an entire podcast on this, we talk about learning in a lot of detail. learning's at the heart of becoming a habit mechanic, because you're learning how to build better habits. And the habits you're going to get best at are the ones that you practice often. So many of us are walking around every day practicing mindlessly, worrying and getting stressed and beating ourselves up, and we're not even aware of it. But it's going on silently, mindlessly. And that means that we're habitualizing that way of thinking. So if we want to think in a more positive, helpful way, then we've got to practice that instead. And I experienced this firsthand because I did a big set of theories I looked at in my PhD work was around something called meaning-focused coping, where you deliberately change the meaning of something that's stressful. You change it into something more helpful. And I noticed that over that time of my PhD work, I just started to naturally think in a more positive, helpful way. It's the same with the end of day 3-1 reflection that we discussed in chapter 5, and that every day people are posting in the Habit Mechanic University app. That's a way of practicing thinking in a different way. Because the most powerful way to practice thinking is to write things down. So yeah, the things that we practice thinking about will become our habits, and already are our habits. And it's becoming easier than ever to think in a unhelpful way because of the VUCA world, and because of, say largely, significantly, I think, is that media outlets and other media organizations have learned that negatively framed headlines get more traction, they get more attention, so they frame things more negatively, because we live in the attention economy. So although it's difficult to get our attention onto helpful things, it's absolutely viable to do. And just one example, one of the super habits that I've resurrected in recent weeks is I'm not checking the news in the week. I might listen to the news at the end of the day if I have time, if I'm walking or something. But I'm not checking. I'm not proactively going to check any news. I just catch up at the weekend.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conclusion that you've reached in that specific example, John, and it's perhaps an easy lesson for people to take away if they want to. And just to digress briefly, as someone who is a trained journalist and did a journalism course, you're absolutely right, and I would defend the trade of journalism and cite its absolute critical importance for democracy. But nevertheless, there's something wrong, because yes, we were indeed told that to look for conflict is a phrase I remember one tutor telling me over and over again. So that is an absolute fair analysis. But anyway, we'll move on further into chapter 9 and back to your analysis and the insights you're providing then about the human brain. And then I think what's so useful again in chapter 9 is you highlight very clearly how this unhelpful thinking can waste massive amounts of time for us, and time's a limited resource for all of us.
That's right, Andrew. There are only 24 hours in a day. That's all we've got. And the visual metaphor that we like to use is that your 24-hour period is a bit like a barcode. So think of the white lines as representing times in the day, which when you're thinking and doing things that are helping you to be at your best. Think of the black lines as representing times in the day when you're thinking and doing things that are making it more difficult for you to be at your best and achieve your goals. And we've all got black and white lines throughout the course of our day. The key thing to start to work out is, where are the white lines? Where are the black lines? And then one small black line at a time, we can start to reduce and minimize, so that we have a better chance of spending more of our 24 hours doing and thinking things that are helpful for us. That includes high quality sleep. It includes high quality, what we call recharge. it also includes high quality focus work, etc. But yeah, I think that it's harder than ever to, or it's easier than ever to get more and more black lines in your day, and it's harder than ever to get rid of them. But if we take a robust habit building approach, we can quite quickly get rid of some of those red lines and start getting back more of our time so that we can spend more and more time doing things that are helpful for us. I hear on a regular basis from people that just after using one habit mechanic tool, building a really robust habit building plan around how they're going to use that tool, that they save at least 1 hour per day not being distracted, not doing unhelpful things. And often it's much more than that. People report 90 minutes up to 2 hours sometimes. And that's just after one sort of bout of trying to do this. So yeah, we can waste an awful lot of time. It's easier than ever to do. But equally, if we proactively do me power conditioning, we can get more of our time back. So we can be doing and thinking things that are more helpful for helping us to be healthy, happy, and at our best.
Yeah, I think the idea of a barcode is a fantastic visual reference for people, with the white being the helpful actions and thoughts and the black being the unhelpful. I mean, just to help people really get this concept really fixed in their heads. Obviously, it's in the Habit Mechanic book, which of course we want everyone to read. But just for someone casually listening to this podcast, just give us an example then of a white line, if you like, a helpful thought and action, and what the full gamut, but it's not perhaps as obvious as people might think. And then on the contrary, the example of a black line.
Yeah, it could be doing your daily tea plan, a white line. It could be doing some exercise before you start work in the morning. So there would be some examples. Black line might be trying to multitask, so trying to do some focus, clever, what I'd call ice sculpture building work, but then you keep breaking off to check your email. So you're trying to multitask when that doesn't work. Black line might be having a cup of coffee before you want to go to sleep in the evening. Could be staying up too late rather than getting good quality sleep, meaning that you'll be tireder the next day, less productive, etc. So yeah, and I think when people use our habit metric tools in the book, I think the first one's in chapter 12, and then we have some more in-depth ones in chapter 16, and then we have the leadership habit metric tools in chapter 29, or maybe actually 28, 30, 31, 32, 33. When you start to use those tools, you quickly recognize where the black lines are for you, and where you can start to get some wins in terms of getting rid of those black lines.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's a really, really important thing for people to understand, that this time well spent versus time unproductively spent can also include things like thinking unhelpful thoughts. It really is a revelation when you first are presented with these concepts that are in the habit mechanic, and of course you've used in your training with tens of thousands of people in different organizations over the last 20 years. I'm gonna move on to talk about the rest of chapter 9 in a few moments, John, but just briefly, I know you've been working on your one-to-one leadership coaching activities and working with more and more people to help them improve the people they work with, their teams or their people's happiness and performance. Just give us an update on that, if you would. How's that going, and how can people learn more about it if they wanted to?
Yeah, well, in relation to that, we actually had an article published in Forbes where the headline was what was the headline? I can't remember.
Psychometric tests don't work was basically the thrust of it, I think. Yeah, I saw that as well myself. Yeah.
Why habit metrics are a better solution. So we're actually starting to get that kind of traction now around why our leadership development is so much more powerful than the average thing that's out there. I think that the difference that people tell me about our leadership development work is that it doesn't just end with analysis or predictions about leadership behavior. It actually shows leaders step by step how to build better habits across our 4-stage leadership model: the role model, the action communicator, the cultural architect, the SWOT coach, and also using our 5-stage team power model. So leaders have actually know what to do and they know how to help themselves, but also their teams build better habits and, get rid of more of these black lines. So yeah, the leadership development work is going really, really well. And I think it's harder to be a great leader than ever before. So this stuff's more important than ever before because change is happening at a rate of knots. So leaders' jobs are harder, and the whole new way that we're working, the hybrid approach we're taking, is making it more difficult to lead because communication, collaboration is more challenging, therefore influencing other people's behavior is more challenging. Therefore, our leaders need a different set of skills to the ones that they used when they saw their team members every day in the office. So yeah, the work we're doing with the leaders using our proprietary habit metric tools is really good, and it's really powerful, and we're just getting great results. So I'm really pleased by that.
Yeah, fantastic, and it's fascinating how at every point of when we discuss the services you offer, just in brief on some of the podcasts, they connect back so clearly to what we're discussing in the content of the Habit Mechanic book. Just briefly again, before we move back on to chapter 9, Jon, in terms of your one-to-one leadership, you do, I know, teach people how to use your proprietary habit mechanic metrics assessment tools. And in the Forbes article that you've just mentioned, you talk about these and contrast them very sharply to traditional psychometric tools. Just give us a brief overview of that and how they help people to start to develop super habits.
Yeah, so the challenge with traditional psychometrics is that they were designed before we understood how brains worked, and they're now being called by very prominent neuroscientists. They're saying that psychometrics are about as predictive as horoscopes. So they're not particularly helpful. They create deterministic mindsets about ourselves, about we're either a good leader or not. The habit metric tools actually move beyond the outdated black box way of thinking about ourselves, and they incorporate what we know about how brains work. And the starting point for that is that most of what we think and do is mindless habitual behavior, and the habit metric tools, which essentially break leadership down into about 100 different micro habits, they allow you to move past your mindless automatic behavior and start to analyze your habits across being a role model, being an action communicator, being a cultural architect, being a SWOT coach. They allow you to see what you're doing well, but also areas that you can improve. And then they act as the foundation to start building small new helpful habits. And we use our 9-action factor, our habit building plans, also our culture development reflection tool, and our 5-stage team power model to help leaders to actually start building better habits individually and collectively, so that they don't just know what they need to do to be a better leader, they can actually build the habits and create a culture that makes it easier for their team and their people to build the habits. that will allow everyone to be healthier, happier, at their best more often, allow everyone to contribute towards the team, the organization actually achieving its goals. So we just posted a blog about that article on the Tougher Minds website, which people can check out.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you're interested in the Forbes article, Jon has produced a blog which contains the article and some other links as well, which are really fascinating. You can find that on tougherminds.co.uk. And I guess, Jon, if anyone is interested in learning more about the one-to-one leadership coaching you offer, then contact you via the website.
Yeah, just get in touch via the website, and you can take a deep dive into that stuff yourself. It's all in step 4 of the book. So you can see all that in step 4 of the book, which is the chief habit mechanics section.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we're going to, of course, be talking about that as well on this podcast in the coming weeks. So do stay with us. Back to chapter 9 then of the Habit Mechanic book for this podcast, Jon. I think something that's really, really important as well. I remember when I was much younger, being in W.H. Smith's, which not so many of them exist now, but basically they were called a newsagent and they sold books. And I was at a station and there was a book on the shelf, which was quite old, but it was a book that they obviously sold a lot of, and people perhaps just picked up spontaneously. I think it was called The Power of Positive Thinking, and people often cite positive thinking as a bit of a cure-all for times when we're not performing well, times when we're not feeling well. But you cite, I think, again, this was when I first began working with you, it was such a revelation to me, and it was so important. You cite a very important distinction between helpful thinking and unhelpful thinking not being the same as positive versus negative. Please explain that to us, because it is so fascinating.
Yeah, so for me, it's more helpful to frame thinking within the on the continuum, of helpful to unhelpful rather than positive to negative. So sometimes something that's positive can be really unhelpful. For example, I might really like donuts, and this morning for breakfast I had 3 donuts, and although it was very positive in the moment, it was actually really unhelpful for my weight goals. We see that in chapter 23 in the confidence chapter. I talk about Jean Twang's work, Generation Me, where she looks at the role of the American education system forcefully injecting confidence into the education system, and the negative impact that's had on young people being not very resilient, being very fragile. So in that example, one just simple example there is that if we want more people to have more confidence, they said no one's going to lose anymore. Everyone will be a winner, so everyone's going to get a trophy. And what that's actually led to is lots of young people with really high self-esteem, but really low self-efficacy, which leads to really fragile confidence. So that's another example where positive is actually being really unhelpful. If we flip it around, sometimes a negative can be really helpful. So within the thrust of that same example, I was similar to the Jean Twangy confidence example. If I get some negative feedback from my boss today, it might not feel great in the moment, but it might be really helpful in helping me to develop and get better at my role. If I step on the weighing scale and it isn't where I want it to be, then that might be really helpful because it's the kick up the backside I need to start getting my diet and my exercise back on track. So it's important not just to get fixated on what the positive psychologists would call the hedonic treadmill, just positive. We need to strike a balance between the positive and the negative. The way, or a model that I'm very compelled with in that space is Barbara Fredrickson's work. flourishing and languishing. And that's where the 3-to-1 ratio comes from. She talks about 3-to-1, 3 positives to 1 negative is a minimal ratio for flourishing. She calls that grounded positivity. So the negative gives us something to work on and to improve and to keep going. And the 3 positive give us the confidence and the belief, that it is worthwhile to keep going. Sometimes that ratio needs 11 positives to the 1 negative, because the 1 negative can be so helpful, so heavy rather. So yeah, we can go into the weeds, into the theoretical stuff there, but at a high level, I don't think it's very helpful to think about thinking as positive versus negative. I think it's much more powerful to think about thinking as helpful thinking and doing versus unhelpful thinking and doing. And of course, that's going to be absolutely subjective, based on your experience. And that's also central to the habit mechanic approach. We never tell you what you need to do. We just give you the insights, we give you the toolkit, and it's up to you to work out how to make it work in your own life. For something that's very helpful for me might be really unhelpful for you. Something that's really unhelpful for me to think and do might be really helpful for you to think and do. So we just need to know what the rules are, the parameters, and then work out the middle bit ourselves.
Yeah, it's fantastic. There's a couple of things I'd like to just pick up on there, John. I know throughout the habit mechanic, you use lots of examples drawn from high performance sport. Of course, you yourself are involved in high performance sport, and I know, whilst never having been in the room when it's happened, we know it happens and takes place. Sometimes it's useful to consider and draw these parallels with the way that high performance athletes and players work. Let's specifically say in soccer or football, a player might be shown by a coach an example of a mistake they've made, which is very negative, a negative experience perhaps, and might have resulted in a really high profile setback or failure on the sports field, which we know generates massive media attention. But as you say, it's a helpful kick up the backside for that player, provided it's presented correctly. And of course, you talk much more about this in the leadership work you do, and in the habit mechanic book. It's helpful for the player to have that shock to the system, if you like. Is that a fair parallel to draw, to take that example from sport?
Yes, but it depends on the player. And the best coaches, they almost know the ratios they need to communicate to the players with. So some players are 11-to-1 players. They need 11 positives for every negative. And there'll be a reason for that, because, they may have had, there's one player I remember working with, very high profile in terms of the next best thing, the next big superstar, etc., but have been treated really poorly by, let's say, an old school, in fact, a very high profile old school manager that just completely destroyed this kid's confidence, to the point where you would ask, what are the important things in your game as a striker? And he'd say speed, strength, and you'd say, well, out of 10, where do you think you are in terms of speed? And the guy would say, I'm about a 6 out of 10. This guy could have been a 100-meter Olympic sprinter if he wanted to be. He was that fast.
I think we might have just lost you then for a moment, John, and it's the best part of the story. So could we have that again, please? You were telling us how the guy rated himself.
Yeah, so he rated himself, let's say, for speed, 6 out of 10, when the reality was he could have been an Olympic sprinter if he'd have wanted to be. He was that fast. For strength, he gave himself something similar, maybe a 5 out of 10. Yeah, he was, 6'2", really built, really strong. That was his self-perception. He didn't see himself like others saw him. So, yeah, that's why it's important to understand the science that sits behind. This is all about brain function, ultimately. If you give people too many negatives, the limbic regions of the brains take over, the PFC shuts down, and people can't learn from about the thing you're trying to get them to learn from the video feedback, if it's a sports example, because they're their cue is out of the cage, if you like, and all it can think about is the worry and the problem and the threat. So yeah, I think the best coaches, they are using, it's almost like that player needs about this ratio, this player needs about this ratio. But the negative's really important. Sometimes for another player, they might need 3 negatives to 1 positive because they might be super cocky and arrogant. So they might need a kick up the backside in order to get them to really focus and understand that their current behavior isn't going to get them to where they want to be. So yeah, this is almost what we're covering in chapter 9 is the basics. Where we need to get to with this is, first of all, understand how it applies to ourselves, but then as a leader and a manager, understand how we can use it to positively influence other people's behaviors.
Yes, I just think it's so worthwhile for people to be introduced to that idea and to start to get to grips with that idea of helpful versus unhelpful thinking is a much better way of considering it rather than positive and negative. Just one more thing on that, John. You said something there which I think is very interesting. You used the word self-efficacy versus self-esteem, and I think that's again another great distinction for people to understand. Just tell us about that, please.
Yeah, so confidence isn't one thing, it's got 2 parts. It's got esteem, which is your belief in how good you are at something, and it has efficacy, that's the evidence that supports your belief. And the metaphor we use for that is the igloo. When we first introduced the igloo of confidence, or the igloo structure in chapter 5 of the book, and we actually show your igloo building up throughout the book. But then we dig into that in more detail in chapter 23, the confidence chapter. So the idea of you have, it's like your life in terms of your confidence levels. You've got almost a housing estate of igloos, and you've got an igloo representing each important part of your life. You could have leadership, could be the MBA that you're doing, you could have been a parent, you could have been a good family member, you could have the Italian language that you're learning, you could have your golf, whatever it is, parenting. So you've got all these igloos. They're in different states of repair. Some are really well built, some are just got foundations, but the overall structure of the igloo represents the esteem, the belief, and then each individual building block is the evidence, the efficacy. And if we want to have robust confidence, we need to have both components.
Yeah, that's another revelatory thing that I found about reading The Habit Mechanic. That these concepts really help you to understand how you work, and that's so helpful. Well, chapter 9, John, concludes then with a look ahead to the content that's coming. And you give us a hint of how you're going to explain the very complex different models of the brain that you use, although of course they're very, very accessible and very practical in the way they're presented in The Habit Mechanic, but massively complex science behind this. But let me assure people, very readily digestible and easy to get to grips with, and enjoyable to get to grips with in the Habit Mechanic book. But you cite 3 different things, 3 models, if you like, of the brain at the end of this chapter: a simple model, a medium model, if you like, an intermediate, as you call it, and a complex model. Just give us that teaser that you give, please, at the end of chapter 9.
Yeah, so in the coming chapters, we're going to dig into each of these models. The simplest way we explain how the brain works is via our lighthouse brain model, where we first introduce the character Hugh, horribly unhelpful emotions, and also Wilhelmina power or willpower, and their relationship in the most basic way we can explain it. Then we dig a bit deeper in the second model, which I see it's like the intermediate model, which is the 8 brain, the alive perceived energy brain, versus the hack brain, the helpful attention control brain. People who are familiar with Tougher Minds and the Habit Mechanic are familiar with the 8 brain and hack. And we talk more about some of the high level brain structures involved in the thrusts of how we instinctively behave and how we can start to manage those instincts to build more helpful habits. And the most complex level, I suppose, of what we're talking about is emotional regulation. And that can be almost a nonsensical term. But my hypothesis is that emotional regulation is the number one thing, is the most important thing we can learn how to manage and get better at. And that's the foundation of building a new habits, being able to regulate the old behavior, and so we can start to build a new behavior. And actually we can build emotional regulation into a habit. So we can build what we call implicit emotional regulation. So it's like semi-automated emotional regulation. And I go into the details of that and the brain sites involved in that within that chapter, which we'll come on to in a few episodes' time. So yeah, this chapter is a real foundational introduction to how our brain works. In the highest level is that it's always on, we're always thinking. But we can also start to manage how we think, so that we can be thinking and doing things that are more helpful for us being at our best.
I remember when I first started to do some work with you, Jon, and I attended one of your presentations, and this was the crux of it, about how the brain works. I actually felt a physical impact. It was so revelatory to me. What sort of reactions do you get from people when you highlight this to them, when you open their eyes to this?
Yeah, I think it's just positive, because it allows us to understand ourselves in a completely different way. You know, why wouldn't we teach this to young people? This should just be the first thing that everybody learns about. The whys are because we've only in quite recent history learned about it. But you know, we learn about how our heart works and how our muscles work, you know, in basic biology. We don't learn how our brain works. So not if we do, not in a helpful way, not in a way that you might learn about this lobe and that lobe, but that's kind of just theoretical, disconnected from the human experience. Why wouldn't we learn about how our brain works, so that people have a better understanding of why they do the things that they do? And it's more important than ever to understand these models, because the way that we are being automated to think and to do is becoming less and less helpful for being healthy, happy, and at our best. So if we want to do me power conditioning and proactively work towards being at our best, then it's going to be much easier to do that if we actually understand how our brain works. The thing that, if I see people after those presentations I'm working with over a period of time, I always hear about people laughing at themselves more, but also telling me about other people's hues and innate brains and just how they don't recognize what they're doing. So yeah, I think very quickly learning about these models just completely changes the way you think about yourself, but also others, in a really positive, helpful way.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I've seen countless examples. I can tell people of that look of revelation and realization on people's faces. It really is a fascinating moment to see.
And if you go onto the Tougher Minds website and you look at some of the case studies, and I'd say in particular look at the educational case studies, you can see kids that are about 10 years old talking about this stuff and talking about how it's changed what they do just by learning about this stuff, which is also fascinating that you can learn it at such a young age and it can have such a big impact on your life.
Yeah, but as you say, Jon, I think it is because of the very, very accessible, very practical, digestible way you present these ideas. And I think it is something, in my experience, that young people do readily accept and do readily get to grips with, and it helps them in the same way as you rightly say they might learn about other parts of their body. And we that's certainly part of my education when many decades ago. But it would be fantastic to think that young people were shown and had their eyes open to this aspect of being alive. I think it would be so useful.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll get there, and this will just be what people learn about. And I can see the habit mechanic GCSE coming in the not too distant future.
Well, let's hope it's sooner rather than later. It's been great to talk about Chapter 9, Jon. Thanks for your time once again. Please do like and subscribe to this podcast. Leave us a 5-star review if you can on the podcast platform of your choice. Don't forget to check out the Tougher Minds website, tougherminds.co.uk, the blog section, as Jon says, with that new article that Jon's written for Forbes.com about psychometric testing and why they don't work, and habit metrics should be what we're thinking about. It's been another fascinating episode, Jon. We'll look forward to many more. Anything else you'd like to say in closing?
Well, thanks for listening, first of all. I hope that's been interesting for you. And I think the thing to, I'm going to say think, I think quite a few times here, the thing to be thinking about is your thinking, and that you're always doing it, and that many of the things that we automatically think about are not always that helpful for us being at our best. If you've got a copy of the Habit Mechanic book, just skip ahead and take some of the self-assessments, and that will make it easier for you to analyze your current thinking and whether it's helpful or not helpful. Particularly look at the ones in chapter 17. There are 2 habit metric tools in there. And then just pick an area to work on and create a habit building plan to help you to practice thinking and doing in a different way. And very quickly you can make some really good progress in terms of getting rid of some of those black lines in your 24-hour period. Building new habits isn't always easy. There are often bumps in the road, and those bumps are essential, because if we don't fail, we can't learn and we can't grow. So expect to fail and take it as a positive or a helpful thing when you do, because it's going to help you to learn more about yourself. Keep persisting. That is the key thing, because you're only ever one habit away. Thanks for listening to the Habit Mechanic podcast. If you liked it, please subscribe and tell someone else about one of the ideas or insights that you found most interesting.